I'm Jim Czek. You're watching Now Media. With me, Scott McInnis, MLA for the BC Conservatives, and also the Shadow Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. Thank you for joining me.
Nice to meet you, Jim. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, we just did that interview a couple days ago now. I think it was on Friday, maybe, with Jeff Moyse, a lawyer that specializes in Aboriginal law, and I think he's practiced in that field for 33 years. So I guess you could deem him an expert in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of time for Mr. Jeff Moyse. He's one of the few people in this province who have the experience and knowledge directly related to this file. And I think what he said on Friday was very digestible for the public, and really appreciate his comments here.
Yeah, it was a very good, that's where he wanted to start. He wanted to do it as more of an education base and then talk about the case specifically. But I thought that was great starting first and just saying, hey, this is what's really going on. And the one thing that he pointed out, and this is kind of our headline here, that the BC NDP, because I asked them what would be the difference between the NDP if they were in government or the Conservatives, and he said, well, the NDP have made an ideological decision not to argue extinguishment, which he thinks is the best defense in private lands, because all lands start owned by the Crown at some point, whether the Crown awards it, the BC Crown awards it to the private landowner, or the federal Crown awards it to the landowner. So if they don't argue that, then, you know, and he said also that you can't have two people having the title there, and, you know, like there's a cloud over those lands there in Richmond right now.
Yeah, I think Jeff laid that out, Mr. Moyse laid that out very, very articulately last week. You know, this is very concerning. Obviously, if you're a private property owner, specifically in Richmond or somewhere else in BC, this has really thrown again, a cloud over to, you know, the actual ownership rights that you have over your private property in relation to Aboriginal title. You know, the judge had made it very clear that the two can coexist, but also saying that certain properties are null and void now due to the finding of this Aboriginal title by the Supreme Court. So it throws a lot of question marks up into the air, Jim. And our concern is, you know, opposition members, is that the government has this tool in the toolbox to argue extinguishment of Aboriginal title when fee simple land was granted, but they are making in our assumption, the ideological decision not to do that, which is, I think, you know, just creates more uncertainty for not only the people on the Fraser River in Richmond, but across the province as well.
Well, I think that cloud hangs over those properties specifically right now, because it, you know, like it'd be really tough. We talked about it in the interview. I'd advise people to go watch that interview. I think it's a really good interview to watch. There's a cloud over those properties. Like, I mean, like right now, it'd be really tough to sell those properties if you're a private landowner, because it'd be really tough, likely, to get a mortgage on those properties, because at some point, the Cowichan tribe could say, well, those are our properties. You don't have a legal right to them. And then the only recourse the private landowner would have then is to sue the government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also the piece about the devaluation potentially of these properties kind of in the short term with the uncertainty created with Aboriginal title. I mean, it's, you know, to look at it as plain as day. If you're somebody that now looks, my goodness, I'm not sure of what's happening with my private property, I'd like to put it on the open market. You can almost guarantee that this decision, because we, you know, as far as we sit here today, there isn't a stay put on the decision. You know, that you can reasonably expect that there'll be a devaluation of that property, because the market will look at it and say, well, I don't know at the end of the day if when I purchase this title, if I'm actually the sole owner of it or not. And, you know, I think it was made pretty clear in this court decision that most certainly you are not the sole owner, that it is, you know, coexisting right now with Aboriginal title with some conditions that, as you rightly mentioned, if the Cowichan decide to take measures, you know, to recoup that private property, it looks like they're fully within their rights to do that.
And there's two other First Nations groups that actually, this makes this one really messy, because there's two other First Nations groups that are claiming title to that property as well. So that Richmond piece is definitely a huge point of contention, and I'm not sure how they'll solve that. I believe Jeff had said that it's going to end up in the Supreme Court. There's no other path for it, because nobody's going to be happy with any decision at this point.
Yeah, Jim, you're absolutely right. And I agree with Jeff and others who have spoken out against this. Unfortunately, it creates a very divisive culture within First Nation communities in that specific area, the Tawasin and the Musqueam. I would anticipate, although I'm obviously not speaking on their behalf, that they would also appeal this based on the decision that was made. From listening to various media outlets from representatives from both nations, they've made it clear that it's their fishing rights that are vulnerable here, and their traditional territory. So it's created a lot of uncertainty and unfortunately a lot of division within various First Nation communities, which is not helpful in this grand picture of reconciliation as we move forward.
One of the other big problems in British Columbia is we see kind of like investment capital fleeing the province, and I'm sure this hanging, this kind of like this cloud hanging over property in British Columbia doesn't actually cause a lot more confidence in investment in British Columbia. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, shifting gears to Crown land interests for a second, Jim, I think these rushed land use planning agreements and other arrangements that this government has done has created tremendous uncertainty for industry partners across British Columbia. And they're now looking at, where's a safe place to put my capital and to invest in resource projects? And when you look at the ultimate question is who has final say over whether, a project gets to move forward or not, whether it's local First Nations or the provincial government. And it doesn't appear to me that question has been resolved. If you're the board of directors of a major capital company, you're going to look at this and say, this is just too risky. We can't put our money on the table in a jurisdiction where we don't know where we're going to get our answers from and our permits and where the regulation is coming from, whether it's First Nations or the government. So again, this just goes back to very uncertain decisions that have been made by this government, not only around public land, but how that affects industry in this province as well. Because as you well know, it's not a great environment right now. We see capital fleeing British Columbia at an astonishing rate. And a lot of these question marks around, let's call it jurisdiction over the land base, only adds to that uncertainty.
I think with a lot of people doing land acknowledgements and and a lot of ceremonies, even the RCMP are starting to do whenever they do a press conference, and I think a lot of people think that has more to do with Crown land, but because if they're starting to award private land, which the Crown has already sold to somebody, does it not actually call into question the basis of Canada in general?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I think the issue that we're looking at here is we have an unresolved playing field as far as the relationship goes between private property and Aboriginal title, specifically here in British Columbia. And as Mr. Moyse and other legal professionals in the space have pointed out, the court needs to decide what that relationship is firmly. And one of the two, whether it's Aboriginal title or private property, has to take precedence over the other. And we're still kind of kicking the can down the road here with some of these court decisions as to what that relationship looks like. And it's very unsettling, obviously, for private property owners. As we see in Richmond, I've had several communications with folks there, as have my colleagues, that relationship and that uncertainty around that relationship with Aboriginal title and private property obviously leaves people very nervous. And Mr. Moyse rightly pointed out on your show that, some of these decisions, and I'm not talking about the BC Supreme Court decision for a second, but we're looking at land use planning agreements and other reconciliation agreements that are happening across this province between the government and First Nations. That is, in our mind, undermining what is the gold standard, as Mr. Moyse said it, of finalizing some of these land use, land occupancy questions. And that's the BC Treaty process, which this government seems to have somewhat abandoned in favor of these kind of rushed decisions that are happening quite hastily across this province. And people need to be very concerned about them.
We did reach out to the BC NDP. We reached out to Nikki Sharma, the deputy PM, or premier. And her response was, we asked the question, was it an ideological decision not to argue extinguishment? And there was no answer to that, and just said they were watching the case closely, and we've appealed it. And then we also reached out to the feds, and for some strange reason, it's under the Transport Ministry, which doesn't make any sense to me, but the Transport Ministry, again, failed to make a comment other than that we're watching this case very closely. I think they better start watching it really closely because this will end up in the Supreme Court for sure. I don't see how it doesn't. So, but do you have any logic behind why it's under Transport Ministry?
No, that's a good question. Potentially because of various pieces of transportation infrastructure there that's owned by the federal government, or the federal government has an interest in. I thought it would be at least partially fall under Crown Indigenous relations within the federal government. But and I don't want to say this without being factual, but whether the Port Authority is owned or is under control of the Federal Ministry of Transportation, I'm not certain on that, but that could be a reason why.
And then Jeff also talked a little bit about UNDRIP, and that was what Justin Trudeau in 2016 fully endorsed UNDRIP, and in 2021 Canada passed Bill C-15, also called the UNDRIP Act, which requires Canadian laws to be brought into alignment with UNDRIP principles, the federal government to create an action plan within 2 years to implement UNDRIP across Canada. And then, so I don't think a lot of people really have a really good understanding what UNDRIP is as well.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Again, Jim, we hear a lot of discussion around UNDRIP and the provincial legislation, which is DRIPA, based off of the United Nations Declaration. I think it's really important for listeners to understand that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was never intended to be law in any country. It was intended to be used as a guiding principle for relationships with Indigenous peoples, but it was never intended to be enacted into law. And what we've seen with that is, over the last couple of years under this government, is a fast tracking of a lot of the articles within the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which was voted on in 2019 here in British Columbia. We saw the attempt last year with aligning the Land Act with DRIPA, which was, faced tremendous public pushback. There are other components. For example, when we're looking at land, DRIPA operates under the premise that British Columbia could be in its entirety titled land. And that's why we're seeing some of these land use planning agreements and Section 7 consent agreements around the use of land is purely based off of the DRIPA legislation, which again comes from the United Nations Declaration. Now, I want to make something very clear on that note, Jim, is that opposing or questioning the DRIPA legislation is not anti-reconciliation. Okay, this government has done a really good job in its messaging of combining the two and saying that reconciliation is the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. In their quest, ideologically so, for reconciliation based on, it's their way or the highway. And we just simply don't believe that's the case at all. And as we're seeing now, it's creating tremendous uncertainty, increased division between not only Indigenous and non-Indigenous British Columbians, but between Indigenous groups within this province. So we stand fully behind our commitment to repeal that legislation, which is DRIPA, and looking more at the Constitution, Section 35, which is constitutional protections of Aboriginal rights, and on the land base that's being consultation and accommodation where it makes sense. So, this law in British Columbia, based off the United Nations Declaration, has created a tremendous amount of uncertainty for individuals and for industry. And it's something that we look at that has to be taken off the table.
Yeah, like you brought up a point there and you said, it could mean that, all of BC is subject to title claim, which would mean then the Crown was selling land that it didn't have a right to, and it's been collecting taxes on land it doesn't have a right to. So the only recourse for the people that bought that land from the Crown, because like I said, all land originates from the Crown at some point, because people didn't own it. They didn't buy it from any First Nations group, so they bought it from the Crown. So that calls into question the validity of the Crown then, I guess, if they continue down this path of not defending private land that's already been awarded by the Crown.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the government has wholeheartedly failed in not only explaining that to British Columbians and bringing them on board with what is taking place here, but absolutely you're right. Is that it brings into question not only the validity of private property, but the Crown's interest in property, which is Crown land across this province. Again, if you read the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and I encourage everybody to do that. It's not an extensive document. It's just, I think it's 5 or 6 pages long. But Article 26 alludes to the fact that, British Columbia, in a sense, and the land and the resources on that belong to First Nations. And that question and these questions that we're talking about, these discussions around private property and Crown ownership, really brings that all under a cloud because of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. It does not lay that groundwork clearly for British Columbians, and it brings into a lot of legal questions and constitutional questions because that's in conflict with Section 35 of the Constitution Act.
Another question I had, Ian and I were talking, our managing editor, is like, we're not seeing this important court decision really being played out in many big media outlets where they're really digging into it. Like, I mean, Kelowna Now is a small regional outlet that, we're trying to do the best we can. But why do you think that the media is kind of leaving this lie as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, it was a pretty hot topic in the Lower Mainland for a couple of days following the decision. But I truly believe that the government coming out hastily and saying that they were going to appeal the decision probably put some of those concerns to bed. But I think it's the details in which the appeal will be brought forward, which still puts a lot of question marks on people and why folks like us are having these conversations. But I think the general public is still not kind of caught up to speed on some of these implications around not only this decision, but many others that are happening by this government across the province, because they're doing it quickly and without adequate public consultation. And we firmly believe as opposition members that this whole idea of Indigenous relations involves all British Columbians. And this government has decided to take a position that they will negotiate on all of our behalf with Indigenous governments related to a lot of these critical issues, but they certainly don't ask for our input on what our positions are. So we have a big problem with that. But you're right, Jim. It's simmered down, but there are still people asking those legitimate questions. And like I said, people like Jeff Moyser and others are keeping that at the forefront because there are details around specifically this court case that questions deserve to be asked about.
You put out a tweet here a couple hours ago, actually. The NDP does not include the public, just like you said, in reconciliation. Okanagan Falls deserves local representation without delay. Can you bring us quickly up to date as to what you're talking about there?
Yeah, absolutely, I can. This is my colleague Donegal Wilson for Boundaries and Milkamina file that she's been working really hard on. So the residents of Okanagan Falls have voted to incorporate as a municipality very recently. And under those articles, they're entitled to elected representation, which then can collect taxes and things of that nature to move forward as a municipality should. But by all accounts, this is being held up in negotiation between the provincial government and the Osoyoos Indian Band with a list of concessions from the OIB about what they need to see before incorporation takes place. Most certainly the people of Okanagan Falls were not made aware of this. This is not what they voted for, certainly in having a list of concessions made, which haven't been made public, by the way, from the Okanagan, the Osoyoos Indian Band. So people are quite frustrated, and lots of folks have been reaching out not only to myself, but more so to my colleague Donegal Wilson, looking for answers. I know my colleague Donegal Wilson, MLA Wilson, has been shut out of some of those conversations with government and the OIB, which is, I don't think, good practice by this government. But again, it shows their ideological drive forward that they will, behind closed doors, like they've done with many other agreements, negotiate locally with First Nations, and then come out and give the public that information. And we just don't simply think that that's right. I know, again, the people of Okanagan Falls are not happy with this, but at the same time, this doesn't fall on the plate, or this is not the fault of the Osoyoos Indian Band. This is the fault of this policy and this framework that the government has put in place to allow this to happen. So, we're firmly opposed to what's taking place in Okanagan Falls right now, and the folks there deserve their elected representation, which they voted on.
So thank you for all this. Is there anything else that you want to add today, or we'll check in with you, because this story is not going away.
No, it most certainly isn't, Jim. And there'll be lots, I'm sure, coming out in the coming weeks and months about, not only the court case and the avenues that are moving forward with appeals, because there's lots of question marks specifically to other parties involved in the litigation. But, there are lots of things happening behind the scenes that I'm hearing about with further land use planning agreements. Obviously next week, Joffrey Lakes will be closed to the public for 2 months, which I'm sure and I'm hoping will get into the news again, because the government closing that park to the public, to non-Indigenous British Columbians, is completely a mistake in our view. And I just really want to echo what Mr. Moyse said the other day, and just hoping that people keep their ear to the ground and really pay attention to what's at stake here, and what the path forward is for this government when it comes to Indigenous relations, which is one of secrecy and keeping the public sort of out of that conversation.
Yeah, and I would ask people to go and watch that interview with Jeff Moyse. It's a very good interview, very educational on the topic. And, it would help us if you went out there and shared it, because we still fight Bill C-18 here. A little plug for ourselves, fighting Bill C-18, because they took away our audience of 200,000 with Bill C-18, not allowing us to reach our audience that we earned serving this community for over a decade. So we'd appreciate that, and we still fight that. We're still fighting the good fight. But we do thank you for your time, and we really appreciate it as well, Scott.
Thank you, Jim, and keep up the hard work on behalf of local media. Keep it up. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Cheers. And thank you for watching Now Media.
We don't report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent.